On January 17, 1994, at 4:30 a.m., the residents of Los Angeles County were violently awakened by what would become one of the most destructive natural disasters in California's history. The Northridge earthquake, measuring a 6.7 on the Richter scale, struck the San Fernando Valley with unprecedented force, catching residents in their sleep and forever changing the landscape of earthquake preparedness in America. While lasting about 20 seconds, the earthquake claimed 57 lives, injured thousands, and caused an estimated $20 billion in damage. Today we'll examine the devastating physical impact of the earthquake, the tragic human death toll, the emergency response efforts, and the lasting legacy of this catastrophic event. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters, where we cover some of the most devastating events that happened throughout history. The Northridge earthquake occurred on a previously unidentified blind thrust fault in the San Fernando Valley region of Los Angeles. Unlike surface faults that are visible and well mapped, blind thrust faults remain hidden underground, making them particularly dangerous and unpredictable. The earthquake produced some of the strongest ground motions ever instrumentally recorded in an urban environment in North America, with vertical accelerations approaching 1.8 g, nearly twice the force of gravity. What made this earthquake especially destructive was not just its magnitude, but its location in a densely populated area, combined with the upward thrust motion that generated particularly powerful vertical forces. The San Fernando Valley sits atop deep sedimentary basins that amplified the seismic waves. Additionally, the early morning timing meant that most residents were asleep at home rather than dispersed throughout the region, placing them at a greater risk from structural failures in residential buildings. Prior to Northridge, the region had experienced significant seismic events, including the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, also known as the Silmar earthquake. While building codes had been improved following that disaster, the Northridge earthquake revealed critical vulnerabilities that remained in the infrastructure of one of America's largest metropolitan areas. The physical destruction caused by the Northridge earthquake was immediate and widespread. Across the San Fernando Valley and parts of Los Angeles, buildings crumbled, roadways buckled, and vital infrastructure systems failed. Among the most dramatic and visible signs of destruction were the collapsed sections of major freeways, including portions of Interstate 10, known as the Santa Monica Freeway, and State Route 118, known as the Simi Valley Freeway. These collapses not only resulted in fatalities, but also severely disrupted transportation networks in a city heavily dependent on automotive travel. Parking structures proved particularly vulnerable to the earthquake's forces. The California State University Northridge campus was especially hard hit, with several multi-story parking facilities pancaking upon themselves. The Northridge Fashion Center Mall suffered severe structural damage, with portions of parking structures collapsing and causing multiple fatalities. The event exposed critical weaknesses in the design and construction of these large concrete structures. Residential buildings throughout the region sustained varying degrees of damage. Most devastating was the complete collapse of the Northridge Meadows apartment complex, a 3-story wood frame apartment building where 16 residents lost their lives when the first floor collapsed beneath the weight of the upper stories. Thousands of other apartment buildings suffered significant structural damage, often related to weak first stories with parking areas, known as soft-story buildings, that lacked adequate lateral support. Beyond structural failures, the earthquake triggered numerous fires as gas lines ruptured and electrical systems short-circuited. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power reported more than 1,400 water main breaks, hampering firefighting efforts and leaving thousands without clean water. Power outages affected more than 600,000 customers, and telecommunications systems were overwhelmed or damaged, complicating emergency response efforts. The financial toll was staggering. At approximately $20 billion in direct damage, which would be equivalent to over $40 billion in today's dollars, Northridge earthquake was at the time the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Property damage was so extensive that it strained the resources of insurance companies and government disaster relief programs alike. While the physical destruction was evident in collapsed buildings and buckled freeways, the true tragedy of the Northridge earthquake was measured in human lives. The official death toll stood at 57, though some estimates suggest the number may have been higher due to indirect deaths in the aftermath. Each of these deaths represented a personal tragedy, families shattered in seconds by an unforeseeable natural disaster. The causes of death varied, but they primarily resulted from building collapses, falling objects, and medical emergencies exacerbated by the earthquake. The Northridge Meadows apartment complex became the site of the single deadliest incident, with 16 residents crushed when the first floor collapsed. Most victims were killed in their sleep, having no opportunity to seek safety as the building failed around them. The collapse occurred so quickly that even those who woke at the first tremors had little chance of escape. Beyond the fatalities, more than 8,700 people were injured, with injuries ranging from minor cuts and bruises to life-altering trauma. Hospitals throughout the region were inundated with patients, even as some medical facilities themselves sustained damage. Northridge Hospital Medical Center, located near the epicenter of the earthquake, treated hundreds of injured while operating on emergency power and dealing with structural damage to its own facility. The earthquake also created a substantial displacement crisis. Approximately 20,000 people were forced from their homes due to structural damage or safety concerns. Many found themselves sleeping in emergency shelters, makeshift tent cities and parks, or in their vehicles. The psychological impact of this sudden homelessness, combined with the trauma of experiencing the earthquake itself, created long-lasting mental health challenges for survivors. Vulnerable populations were disproportionately affected. Elderly residents, those with disabilities, and economically disadvantaged communities often lived in older structures more susceptible to earthquake damage. Many lacked the resources to quickly relocate or rebuild. The earthquake exposed socioeconomic disparities in disaster readiness and recovery that would inform future emergency planning. The emergency response to the Northridge earthquake represented both the strengths and limitations of disaster preparedness in 1994. First responders faced enormous challenges: collapsed structures with trapped victims, fires erupting from broken gas lines, flooded streets from broken water mains, and the constant threat of aftershocks triggering further collapses. The strongest aftershock, which measured magnitude 5.9, was recorded 1 minute after the main shock, while seismic observatories recorded 3,000 aftershocks greater than magnitude 1.5 in the 3 weeks following the main earthquake. Within minutes of the main shock, emergency services were mobilized across Los Angeles County. Urban search and rescue teams began the painstaking process of locating and extracting survivors from collapsed buildings. At the Northridge Meadows apartments, rescuers worked frantically to search for trapped residents, using sensitive listening equipment to detect signs of life amid the rubble. Throughout the region, similar scenes played out as firefighters, police officers, and civilian volunteers searched damaged structures. Medical response was complicated by damage to several hospitals, including the Olive View Medical Center and Veterans Affairs Hospital, both of which required partial evacuations. Emergency medical services implemented disaster protocols, establishing triage centers and coordinating patient distribution to functioning facilities. Doctors and nurses worked extended shifts, often in challenging conditions with limited resources. The scale of displacement necessitated a massive shelter operation. The American Red Cross opened dozens of shelters, while schools, churches, and community centers became temporary housing for those whose homes were uninhabitable. FEMA established disaster recovery centers to provide assistance with immediate needs and to begin the long-term recovery process. Yet the response revealed significant gaps in earthquake preparedness. Communication systems proved inadequate, with telephone networks overloaded and some emergency radio systems failing. Coordination between different agencies was sometimes hampered by incompatible protocols and equipment. Water supply issues complicated firefighting efforts, while damaged transportation infrastructure made assessing certain areas difficult. The Northridge earthquake's legacy extends far beyond the immediate aftermath. In the months and years following the disaster, significant changes emerged in building practices, emergency preparedness, and public policy. Perhaps most consequential were the revisions to building codes and construction practices. Engineers studied structural failures from the earthquake and identified critical weaknesses, particularly in steel-framed buildings, parking structures, and soft-story apartment buildings. New requirements for stronger connections in steel buildings, reinforced concrete structures, and retrofitting of vulnerable existing buildings were implemented. These changes have undoubtedly saved lives in subsequent earthquakes. The insurance industry underwent a transformation following Northridge. Facing unprecedented claims, many insurance companies restricted or eliminated earthquake coverage in California, triggering an insurance availability crisis. This led to the creation of the California Earthquake Authority, a publicly managed, privately funded entity to provide residential earthquake insurance and encourage mitigation. Emergency response protocols evolved significantly based on lessons from Northridge. Greater emphasis was placed on interagency coordination, communications redundancy, and community-based preparedness. Psychologically, the earthquake changed how Californians view seismic risk. Public awareness campaigns intensified and earthquake drills became more commonplace in schools and workplaces. Scientific understanding of earthquake dynamics also advanced. The Northridge event provided valuable data on blind thrust faults and basin effects that amplify ground motion. New monitoring technologies and modeling approaches were developed, improving earthquake forecasting and early warning systems that continue to evolve today. The 1994 Northridge earthquake remains a defining moment in California's relationship with seismic hazards. In just 20 seconds, it exposed vulnerabilities in infrastructure, emergency systems, and public preparedness. The 57 lives lost stand as a sober reminder of nature's destructive potential, while the response and recovery demonstrate humanity's resilience and capacity to learn from tragedy. 3 decades later, the landscape of Los Angeles bears few visible scars from the disaster. Collapsed buildings have been rebuilt, freeways repaired, and neighborhoods restored. Yet the invisible changes in stronger building codes, better prepared emergency services, more informed communities represents the true legacy of the earthquake. Thanks for watching today's video on this devastating but important historical event. If you found this informative, please hit that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives. And let me know in the comments what other overlooked historical events you'd like to learn about. Until next time, this has been Deadliest Disasters.